Imagine the grand ruins of the Roman Forum, legions marching to conquer empires, the power that shaped the West and left behind a legacy so vast it still fascinates us today. When we think of ancient Rome, we often envision a society of very rigid values, unquestionable military honor, and families that seemed like models of tradition and virtue. But what if I told you that behind this image presented by old films and books, there was a complexity in human relationships and a way of dealing with sexuality that defies everything you've learned and expect? And what if the question that echoes around, was Rome LGBTQ+, doesn't have a simple yes or no answer, but is in fact a portal to a fascinating historical truth that will astound you, forcing us to re-evaluate our own concepts. Prepare to dive deep and uncover what truly happened in Rome regarding homosexuality. It's not a story of modern labels, but rather of ancient rules, power, and very well-defined social roles. To truly understand this part of history, which many people don't even imagine existed or was as it really was, it's super important that you pay attention to every detail, every nuance, because the richness of this discussion lies precisely in the differences between the past and the present. Stay with us until the end, because the distinction between what we think we know and what was actually true can be shocking, and it will change your view of the past and of the forms of love. And if you like uncovering these secrets that school didn't tell you or that movies never show, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us show that these stories, these complex and fascinating historical truths, deserve to be told to more and more people, finally bringing them out of the shadows and simplification. Today, in the 21st century, we use words like gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans to describe a person's identity, who they're attracted to, how they see and express themselves. These terms emerged relatively recently in history, part of a process of self-discovery and the fight for recognition of minorities. They are fundamental for us to understand sexuality and gender in our contemporary society. But in ancient Rome, the mindset was completely different. For the Romans, these modern concepts of sexual orientation or gender identity simply didn't exist. They didn't have a word for homosexual or heterosexual in the sense we use today. The idea that your attraction to a certain gender would define who you are as a person or create a social category for you was utterly alien to Roman thought. They didn't form communities based on who you wished to love, or if a woman loved another woman, for example. This wasn't the main point of social concern. So what mattered to them? What dictated the rules of sexual and social conduct? It was the role you played in a sexual relationship and, even more importantly, your social status and your age. This was the yardstick by which behavior, morality, and social acceptance of any sexual act were measured. Hierarchy, the distinction between who dominated and who was dominated, was the pillar of almost all social interactions in Rome, and sexuality was no exception. Imagine a Roman man, free, born into a patrician family or of good social standing, a respectable citizen who could vote, hold public office, serve in the army, and who had control of his own household as the pater familias. For him, it was totally acceptable, and even considered common and expected, to have sexual relations with other men. The big rule, the invisible line that could not be crossed without serious consequences for his honor and reputation, was he had to be the active partner. He was the one who penetrated, the one who was in control of the situation. This role demonstrated power, virility, dominance, and his superior position in society. It was like asserting his masculinity and authority in all spheres of life, including the sexual. For the true Roman man, it was essential to display this control in every aspect of life, including sexually. But the other side of the coin was very different, and that's where things got complicated for a Roman citizen's reputation. The passive partner, the one who was penetrated, had to be someone considered socially inferior or in terms of status. We are talking about categories of people who, in Roman society, were already in a position of submission: slaves, whether male or female; freed persons, people who were enslaved and gained their freedom but still carried a social stigma; prostitutes, male or female, who were marginalized; or young men who were not yet considered full adult men; minors or adolescents who had not yet donned the toga virilis, the symbol of adulthood and full citizenship. This division was rigid and very clear in the Roman mind, as clear as the divisions of social classes and the value of citizenship. There was no general prohibition on sex between men per se, but there were very strong social rules about who could be passive without suffering enormous dishonor. For a free male citizen, being the passive partner in a sexual relationship with another man was a serious affront to his honor and masculinity. This was the line that differentiated the acceptable from the shameful. It was a logic of power, hierarchy, and control, not of sexual preference or identity, as we understand it today. It is crucial to understand this fundamental difference so as not to fall into interpretation traps when looking at the past through present-day eyes, imposing categories that simply did not exist. Romans lived in a world of status and convenience, not fixed sexual identities. This logic of who was active and who was passive, who dominated and who was dominated, helps us understand the stories of many emperors and famous figures of Rome. These narratives come to us through the writings of historians and poets of the time, such as Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio Cassius, and the poets Catullus and Martial, who recorded the life and customs of the Roman elite, often with criticism, but always revealing the social norms of the time. Think of names like Julius Caesar, one of the most iconic figures in history, one of the greatest generals and politicians of all time, whose name became synonymous with power and leadership. There are many ancient accounts that insinuate or describe his relations with men, including foreign kings and rulers during his military campaigns. A notorious example is his relationship with King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, which generated gossip and satirical songs in Rome about Caesar being the Queen of Bithynia. However, this in itself did not make him gay in the modern sense, nor did it diminish his image as a military or political leader. On the contrary, for some Romans, it could be seen as a demonstration of his power and influence, his ability to conquer even those above other peoples, exercising his dominant position. The criticism of Caesar in this case was not for having a male partner, but for insinuations that he might have been the passive partner in the relationship, which would be a stain on his virtues, virility, and honor. Or think of Hadrian, another influential emperor and one of the 5 good emperors, known for his passion for Greek culture and his architectural works. He had a deep and well-known love for a young Greek man named Antinous. Their relationship was public, and Hadrian's grief over Antinous' premature death, who drowned in the Nile River, was so immense that he ordered entire cities built in his honor, like Antinopolis in Egypt, and elevated him to the status of a god, with cults and temples dedicated to him throughout the empire. This explicit adoration of a young male partner would have been unthinkable in many other societies of the time, but in Rome, under certain conditions. In this case, Hadrian's unquestionable imperial position and Antinous' status as a beautiful youth, and thus an acceptable passive partner, it was tolerated, if not universally applauded, but certainly not condemned in the same way it would be today. The acceptance resided in the power dynamic. Even Nero, famous for his eccentricities, tyranny, and cruelty, had relations with men. He even married one of his freed slaves, Sporus, in a public and formal ceremony, treating him as if he were a woman, and Nero himself, sometimes dressed as a bride. This behavior shocked the Roman elite. But the main scandal was not so much the fact that Nero had a male partner, but rather that he inverted social roles in a way that was seen as humiliating and unnatural for his position as emperor. That is, he acted in ways that suggested passivity or submission, behaviors that were not acceptable for a free and powerful man. It was a grave affront to the emperor's dignity and to Roman values of masculinity. For these men in power, having male partners did not stain their reputation, as long as they were always in the position of dominators, the active one. This was seen as an extension of their power, their potentia, sexual power, and virility. The honor of a free, adult Roman man was only stained and compromised if he was the passive partner in a relationship with another man. Being penetrated was seen as something that took away masculinity, that put you in a position of weakness, submission, and even effeminacy. This was an immense shame, infamia, for someone who was supposed to be the head of the family, pater familias, the relentless warrior, the exemplary citizen who defended Rome and generated heirs. Therefore, Roman society did not condemn the sexual act between men itself, but rather the position, active or passive, and the social status of the free man in that act. This distinction of roles and power is what truly defined social acceptance and reputation. They did not have the same notion of sexuality as we do today, where attraction to the same sex defines an identity. For the Romans, honor, social status, the demonstration of power and conformity to gender expectations linked to citizenship were everything. This is the major difference we need to grasp when studying ancient Rome. While today we speak of being gay, lesbian, or bisexual as a personal identity, an intrinsic part of who a person is, the Romans were much more concerned with doing, the act itself, and with the social and gender hierarchy involved in that act. A free Roman man, a citizen, could have sexual relations with other men and also with women, without this labeling him as gay or excluding him from society. His primary identity was to be a respectable Roman citizen, and this involved being active militarily, politically, and yes, also in sexual relations, always maintaining a position of power and being active. Roman marriage, for example, was a legally and socially separate institution and had a very specific and pragmatic purpose in society. It was primarily seen as a sacred union, but also a social and economic contract between a man and a woman whose main objective was procreation, to have legitimate children to ensure the continuity of the family, gens, the name, nomen, the patrimony, and the legacy. It was a matter of duty to the state and to one's lineage. The virtue of a Roman woman was closely tied to her ability to be a good wife and mother, while that of a man was tied to his virtues, virility, honor, ability to govern, and generate heirs. So, even if a man had male partners for pleasure or affection, he was still expected to marry a woman and have children. Relationships with same-sex individuals for a free and active Roman man were seen more as a type of personal pleasure, an amusement that existed alongside the obligations of marriage and public life without necessarily replacing them or creating a new category of person. They were generally considered part of the private sphere rather than the public, although this could vary depending on the individual and the context. For Roman women, the situation was even more complex and restrictive. Historical sources are much scarcer when it comes to relationships between women. Roman society was deeply patriarchal, and female sexuality was viewed almost exclusively in terms of procreation and maintaining family honor. Relationships between women, when mentioned by authors like Seneca or Martial, though more rarely and often pejoratively, were generally condemned, not so much for a lesbian identity, a concept that didn't exist, but for diverting the woman from her reproductive role and for being seen as unnatural, since they didn't result in children or linked to depravity. A woman's sexual passivity, however, was the norm, and even expected. A woman's honor lay in her chastity and fidelity to her husband. This is a fascinating contrast with the complex discussions about identities, orientations, and gender expressions we have in our current society, where individuality and self-expression hold different weight and are valued. The Roman view forces us to consider that not everything that seems similar is similar throughout history, and that love and desire manifest in many varied forms depending on the time, place, and social structures. Roman sexual morality was pragmatic and hierarchical, focused on preserving male honor and the continuity of the family and the state, not on romantic attraction or personal identity as we understand it today. Therefore, when we ask ourselves, was ancient Rome LGBTQ+, the answer is not a simple yes or no. It is much more complex, richer, and more challenging than that. The Romans did not have the same categories and understanding of sexuality that we have today. Imposing modern labels like gay or straight on individuals or Roman society is an anachronism, that is, using present-day concepts to judge the past, which distorts historical understanding. For them, what truly mattered was the power dynamic and one's place in society, one's status within a relationship. A high-ranking man could have male partners without being judged or condemned, as long as he was always the active one, the one who dominated and exerted control. This was a demonstration of his virtues and his power. If he was the passive one, the story was completely different, and that indeed brought immense shame, infamia, a stain on his reputation and family honor, which could even affect his political career. This was not a matter of sexual preference, but of failing to maintain the decorum and social role expected of a free Roman citizen. There was no LGBTQ+ community as we understand it today, with groups that identified and fought for rights based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. The concept of rights for minority groups, as we know it, is a much more recent invention. Roman society was deeply hierarchical, and sexual morality was tied to honor, power, citizenship, and everyone's role. It was not a question of who you love, but of how you act, what your place is in that sexual act, and what kind of partner you chose for each role: active, passive, free slave, adult, youth. The truth is that ancient Rome shows us a way of organizing human relationships that is very distant from ours, forcing us to rethink our own ideas about what is normal, what is traditional, or even what is freedom in different historical eras. Understanding this helps us see the past more clearly without falling into the temptation of fitting it into our own modern concepts, and recognizing the historical diversity of cultures and social norms. Instead of a gay-friendly or homophobic society as we conceive them today, Rome was a society that regulated sexuality in a way that, to us, might seem paradoxical, but which made perfect sense within its own structure of power and honor. If the sexual lives of Roman men, especially those of the elite, were already complex, that of Roman women was even more intricate and, for us today, quite limited. Roman society was deeply patriarchal, meaning power and control were in the hands of men. Female sexuality was viewed almost exclusively in terms of procreation and maintaining family honor. The main virtue of a Roman woman was chastity before marriage and fidelity after it. She was the guardian of the family lineage, and her purity guaranteed the legitimacy of heirs. Historical sources are much scarcer when it comes to relationships between women. This doesn't mean they didn't exist, but that if they did, they were even more private, less publicly discussed, and, when mentioned by male authors, often with great condemnation or disdain. Authors like Seneca or Martial, in their writings, made rare and almost always pejorative references to women who had sexual relations with other women. For them, these relationships were condemned not so much for a lesbian identity, a concept that didn't exist, but for diverting the woman from her reproductive role, for being seen as unnatural since they didn't result in children, and for being linked to depravity or immorality. The idea of a sexually active woman outside of her reproductive role with her husband was frequently associated with figures like prostitutes or libertine women, not respectable matrons. A woman's sexual passivity, however, was the norm and even expected. For Romans, the woman was the receptacle for male semen, and her honor lay in her chastity and fidelity to her husband. A virtuous Roman woman was one who fulfilled her duty as wife and mother, remaining modest and devoted to her family. Any deviation from this, including relations with other women, was an affront to social values and rigidly established gender roles. We've talked a lot about honor and dishonor, but what exactly happened when a free Roman man and citizen didn't follow the rules? The most feared consequence was infamia. Infamia was an extremely serious legal and social stain, not just a matter of gossip, but with real implications for a person's life. If a free man was caught or publicly known for being the passive partner in a sexual relationship with another man, he was considered infamous. This meant he lost a number of rights and privileges. He could no longer vote or be elected to public office. His ability to testify in court was compromised, and he was socially marginalized. In a society where status and civic participation were everything for a man, being infamous was social death. He was, in practice, defeminized in the eyes of the law and society. The Roman historian Cicero, for example, in his oratories against political opponents, did not hesitate to use accusations of sexual passivity to discredit and destroy his enemies' reputations, showing how serious this infamia was. Infamia could also apply to other categories of people who did not fit the social norms of acceptable sexual behavior, such as prostitutes, male and female, theater actors, gladiators, and others who lived by the public exposure of their bodies or who subverted hierarchies. These individuals, although part of society, were in a lower social category and were considered infamies by their very profession or behavior. Ancient Rome, therefore, not only regulated who could do what, but also imposed severe social penalties on those who did not conform to its codes of honor and gender roles. Within the complex tapestry of Roman sexuality, prostitution played an important and, in some ways, pragmatically and legally accepted role, although it was socially stigmatized. In Rome, there were prostitutes of all tastes and budgets, from the humblest brothels to the most luxurious. There were even taxes on prostitution, which shows that the state recognized and profited from this activity. For a free Roman man, frequenting prostitutes, both male and female, was considered a legitimate way to seek sexual pleasure, as long as he maintained the active role and did not become emotionally attached to or marry these individuals. Prostitution was seen as an outlet for male desires, which should not tarnish the purity of the wife and family. In this context, the pueri delicati, delicate boys, or katamiti emerged. Young slaves, often of great beauty, who served as passive sexual partners for Roman men. These youths were bought, trained, and could be given as gifts. For the free man, having a puer delicatus was a demonstration of wealth and status, as he could afford to have an object of pleasure at his disposal. The relationship with these young men was not seen as a sign of homosexuality for the active Roman, but rather as an expression of his virility and dominance over an inferior. The focus was on possession and control, not on love or identity. Besides the pueri delicati, there were the fellatores and sinaidi, free men who prostituted themselves by performing passive sexual acts like fellatio, or who behaved effeminately in public. These individuals were met with great scorn and ridicule in Roman satires and comedies. They were the antithesis of what a true Roman man should be, as they subverted the ideal of active and dominant masculinity and were therefore infamous. This clear distinction between the respectable man who sought pleasure with passive partners and the effeminate man who allowed himself to be passive is crucial for understanding Roman sexual morality. When thinking about homosexuality in antiquity, it is almost impossible not to draw a parallel with ancient Greece, especially Athens, where pederasty, the relationship between an adult man and a teenage boy, is often cited as an example of homoerotic relationships. However, it is fundamental to understand that although there were similarities, the Roman approach was distinct from the Greek. In Greece, particularly in cities like Athens, pederasty was often seen as a form of tutoring and education, where the older man, Erastes, not only taught the younger man, Eromenos, about life, politics, and philosophy, but also had a sexual relationship with him. It was a socially accepted and even idealized practice in certain circles, with a strong pedagogical and civic formation component. While pleasure was present, the cultural emphasis was often placed on the youth's development and education. In Rome, relationships between men were also hierarchical and based on differences in age and status, but there was not the same formalization or pedagogical idealization that existed in Greece. The component of education or tutoring was less explicit and valued. The Roman emphasis was more directly on sexual pleasure and the affirmation of the adult male's power. While Romans admired many things in Greek culture, they viewed some of their sexual practices, especially pederasty, as idealized by the Greeks, with a mixture of fascination and repulsion, and did not adopt it with the same formality or philosophical justification. Roman aversion was more about what they perceived as consenting passivity or the active role of the youth in some Greek interpretations, which for a free Roman would be humiliating. Roman pragmatism superseded Greek idealism. Beyond laws and social customs, Roman literature offers a fascinating overview of sexuality at the time, revealing both acceptance and criticism and prejudice. Poets and satirists were masters at observing and commenting on human behavior, and their works provide precious glimpses into sexual relations in Rome. Catullus, one of the greatest Roman lyric poets of the 1st century BCE, is famous for his passionate poems about Lesbia, likely Clodia, a high society woman, but he also wrote frankly about his relations and passions for young men. In his verses, he expresses desire and affection without the moral condemnation that Christianity would bring centuries later. His references to male partners were not a confession of a gay identity, but rather part of a repertoire of pleasures and affections that a man of his standing could experience. What was criticized when it was a lack of control or passivity, not the attraction itself. Martial, who lived in the 1st century CE, was known for his sharp and often obscene epigrams. He frequently satirized sexual hypocrisy and deviations from norms. While writing openly about sexual relations between men, he always made the crucial distinction between the free man who was active, acceptable, and the free man who was passive, condemnable, and ridiculed. For Martial, a Roman citizen's sexual passivity was the major flaw, synonymous with effeminacy and loss of honor, something he explored with sarcasm in his verses. Another important author is Petronius, whose satirical work, Satyricon, offers a vivid and comical portrait of the different facets of Roman life, including extravagant banquets and various sexual relations. The work shows characters engaging in relationships with men and women without major moral taboos, as long as social roles were maintained. Petronius's criticism was aimed more at ostentation, lack of moderation, and decadence, rather than at sexual orientation itself. Even among philosophers, such as the Stoics and Epicureans, there were discussions about pleasure and desire. While many advocated moderation and control of passions, they rarely condemned relations between men per se, unless they led to excess, loss of control, or the subversion of social role. For the Stoics, reason should guide behavior, but the focus was on virtue and self-discipline, not on specific categories of sexual attraction. Pleasure for them was not an end in itself, but something to be managed wisely. These literary sources show us that sexuality in Rome was a complex terrain where pragmatism, social hierarchy, and the pursuit of pleasure coexisted with strict codes of honor. The discussion of sexuality was not about who you love, but about how you behave within the hierarchy and social expectations, with an almost obsessive focus on maintaining masculinity and honor for the free man. It wasn't just in imperial palaces or poets' salons that Roman sexuality manifested. It permeated daily life in the city, with its own often implicit rules and conventions. Beyond formal texts, everyday Roman life offers us clues as to how these norms were lived and perceived. Roman baths, for instance, were not just places for bathing and hygiene, but also important social centers where business was conducted, politics discussed, and yes, where sexual relations, including with prostitutes and slaves, could occur. Privacy, as we know it today, was a rare luxury, and nudity was not a taboo in certain contexts. Roman art, such as frescoes and sculptures found in Pompeii and Herculaneum, frequently depicts erotic scenes that include same-sex relations, confirming the presence of these practices in the Roman imagination and daily life. In the Roman army, legions spent years on campaigns far from home. Relationships between soldiers, while not formally encouraged, were a reality. Again, the power dynamic and active-passive roles would be crucial. An officer could have a young recruit or a slave as a partner, without necessarily compromising his image as a virile warrior. Roman visual culture also gives us clues. Bars, taverns, and even streets were places where prostitution was visible. Erotic graffiti found on the walls of Pompeii, for example, show a variety of sexual acts, including between men, confirming that these practices were not hidden from public view, but rather a recognized part of the urban landscape. Though regulated by implicit social codes and the stigma of infamia for the passive or professionals, it is important to note that even with this apparent openness, Roman morality was a powerful force. Family honor, reputation, fama, and dignity, dignitas, were supreme values, especially for the elite. A man could enjoy various pleasures, but always with the concern of not staining his public image and social position. What was allowed in private or with social inferiors could be disastrous if exposed publicly in an inappropriate way, or if it involved a free citizen in a passive role. The distinction between what was allowed to do and with whom, and what it meant to be a certain thing, is key to understanding ancient Rome. As the Roman Empire entered its period of decline and transformation, especially from the 3rd century CE onwards, social, economic, and political tensions intensified. In parallel, Christianity gained strength, becoming an organized and influential religion, capable of dictating new moral rules that gradually replaced the old ones. The crisis of the 3rd century, with its civil wars, invasions, and economic instability, may have contributed to a search for stricter values and a more defined morality. Christianity offered a new ethical structure and a worldview that, for many, seemed more stable and virtuous in times of chaos. Sexuality, which was previously viewed more pragmatically and hierarchically by the Romans, became a moral battleground for Christians who sought to impose purity and chastity. Imperial laws, influenced by the growing Christian faith, began to reflect this change. As early as the 4th century CE, Christian emperors like Constantine and Theodosius I issued decrees that began to restrict and eventually criminalize homosexual acts. As we have already mentioned, the Theodosian Code and later compilations by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE explicitly criminalized passive male homosexuality, and later, any homosexual act. Penalties could be severe, including confiscation of property, exile, and in extreme cases, even death. The idea of sin replaced that of infamia, and divine punishment joined legal punishment. This transformation was radical and had a lasting impact on the history of Western sexuality. What was once a matter of social convenience and hierarchical position became a matter of divine morality and sin, defining what was natural and morally acceptable in a way that echoes to this day. Roman pragmatic tolerance gave way to Christian moral rigor, fundamentally altering the perception and treatment of all forms of sexuality that did not fit its reproductive precepts. Ancient Rome, with all its grandeur, its social complexity, and its apparent moral rigidity, is a fascinating mirror that reflects the numerous and often contradictory facets of human relationships. It reminds us that history is always surprising us, challenging our premises, and teaching us something new about ourselves, about the world, and about the diverse forms that love and desire can take in different eras and cultures. It is an invitation to look at the past not with judgment, but with curiosity, with the willingness to unravel the nuances that shaped us and continue to inform, subtly or explicitly, many of our own conceptions about sexuality in the present. Thank you deeply for delving with us into this part of Roman history, which many are unaware of, misunderstand, or simply refuse to face. We hope this in-depth journey has expanded your view of antiquity and the diverse and complex ways of relating throughout time. Sharing this video with friends, family, and on your social media helps not only to unravel these mysteries of the past, but also to spread more accurate knowledge about antiquity, demystifying prejudices and anachronisms. By sharing, you become an agent of knowledge, helping to bring to light stories that, due to their complexity or because they do not fit into ready-made and simplistic narratives, are often ignored, distorted, or even censored. Don't stop here. Stay tuned to our channel for more journeys through time, where we continue to explore the most intriguing corners of history, challenging what you think you know, and revealing truths that go far beyond the obvious. Click on the videos appearing on your screen for more historical discoveries that, we are sure, will transform your view of the past and the present until the next great revelation, where history awaits us with more secrets to uncover.